Hi, Professor Aziz. It's really great to see you again.
Great to see you, Professor Johnson.
Could you just give us an introduction of yourself for our audience?
Yes, my name is Sahar Aziz. I am a distinguished professor at Rutgers University School of Law, also known as the People's Electric Law School. And my area of research and expertise is the intersection of civil rights and national security, especially as it impacts Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. And I attempt to do so, or I intentionally do so through a cross-racial and interfaith approach where I look at how the hardships and discrimination against African American communities and other minority communities compare and contrast to the discrimination and civil rights challenges faced by Muslim and Arab and South Asian communities in the United States.
Thanks so much. And I'm Sylvester Johnson, a professor in the Department of Black Studies at Northwestern University. And my research has examined African American religions and relationship to colonialism, national security practices, and other political formations. Really excited to be here and to join this conversation. So let's jump into this discussion of the topic of religious liberty and Black religion and how that has shaped so much of what happens with these ongoing debates about religious freedom. So first of all, you have written a really exciting, enlightening book entitled The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. So could you start us off with some background on what you mean by the racial Muslim and how their religious liberty has been jeopardized?
Yeah. Well, the reason why I decided to take on this scholarly project, which took 5 years, and as those of us who write books know, these become labors of love, was because I had been working in the field as a lawyer, as an advocate, and as a community organizer since September 11th, where we were essentially trying to ensure that our constitutional rights and our statutory civil rights were in fact enforced, because we were experiencing just open mainstreamed bias and stereotyping by the government, the US government, and also by private actors. And the way that the stereotypes were articulated was associating our religion of Islam with terrorism and political violence, and this permanent national security threat, as if we were a fifth column. And that caused me to keep asking in my mind, why are we being so openly persecuted by the US government through various national security laws and policies when we live in this country that prides itself on religious liberty and religious freedom? It often promotes the fact that the First Amendment includes the free exercise clause and the anti-establishment clause, and that it's part of our norms. It's part of not just our laws, but what we are taught in K through 12 education. That this is the country where if you're a religious minority, you are supposed to be safe from persecution. And if you are experiencing persecution or discrimination, it should be an outlier. It should be an unusual anomaly. But that wasn't what was happening. So that was really the research question, is why is it in a country that privileges religious freedom, both in its laws and in its norms, so openly targeting and discriminating against a religious minority, in this case, Muslims? How do the American people reconcile that? How do the courts, how does the public policy officials and government officials, how do they reconcile that? And effectively, what the answer that came out of my research was that we were not being viewed or perceived or treated as a religious minority. To the contrary, we were actually being treated as a race. And that's, once you see the racialization of Muslim identity clearly, then it all makes a lot more sense, and it really is consistent with anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Latino racism, and xenophobia. And again, my argument is not that Muslims are in fact a race. My argument is that Muslim identity has been racialized to represent this kind of biological-like inherent characteristics that make it where you are irredeemable. You are always either an actual national security threat or a potential one. And as a result, the government has to treat you accordingly. And then the private actors get their cue from the government that says, okay, these people are suspect. So when we spy on them, when we snitch on them, when we accuse them of being terrorists, we're being good patriots. We're being good Americans, and we're trying to keep our country safe. Our country, right, safe from them, even if they were born here or had have U.S. passports, that doesn't matter. And so that racial construction, or that social construction of the racialization of Muslim identity, is what I call the racial Muslim.
Yeah, no, that's very exciting, I think, to have this type of intervention in the analysis of what has happened, particularly since 9/11, but not just 9/11. As I'm sure we'll get to talk about this conversation, there's a long history of practices that have shaped this. But I think what you've done is really to elevate the significance of understanding why what scholars, you and other scholars, have termed the racialization of Islam has been such a threatening and significant development. So can you tell us more about why it's important to think of this not just as religious formation, but also what we gain by understanding the significance of racializing a religious population, in this case, American Muslims?
Well, as a critical race theorist, I do start from my starting point of analysis is kind of Derek Bell's racial hierarchy theory, which is that anti-Black racism is unfortunately a permanent trait of American society due to the legacies of slavery. And perhaps even equally as permanent is the anti-Native American bias and racism due to the near annihilation of the indigenous people of North America. And whiteness is always going to be at the top. And both of these, Blackness and whiteness, are social constructions, meaning that they mean whatever our society wants them to mean. And whoever is included in those racial categories then lives by the consequences of that, meaning that if you are in Blackness, and some scholars have called it collective Blackness, then you will experience all forms of systemic discrimination that can be not necessarily intentional or overt, but quite pervasive, or intentional discrimination that is actually articulated verbally, from housing discrimination, voting rights discrimination, mass incarceration, school to jail pipeline, surveillance, and so on and so forth. And I think the literature is very rich, thankfully, at this point in American history, where the record is clear. Right, that anti-Black racism is deeply, deeply embedded in our system structures, and that our laws have failed, I think, to completely eradicate anti-Black racism. In the book, I talk about how religious identity has been racialized historically with Jews and Catholics and Mormons, who were all from Europe. Now, in 2024, someone who is Jewish American of Eastern European origin, or Catholic American of Italian origin or Irish origin, or Orthodox Christian that is of Eastern European origin, in the United States, whiteness has been socially expanded, right? Socially constructed in an expansion to include all of them as at the top of that racial hierarchy. So then that begs the question of, well, where do Muslims fall if Muslim identity is being racialized? Well, by racialized, what I mean is that effectively the characteristics or the belief system or the identity of Islam is treated like phenotype is treated when we think of the more kind of traditional form of American racism, which is heavily determined by what you look like. And of course, what you look like is related to the origin of your ancestry, whether it's Africa, whatever part of Africa, North, Central, South, or Europe, Asia, etc. But what I'm arguing is that when you say your name is Muhammad, or when you wear the hijab, or when you disclose that you practice Islam and you pray 5 times a day, you fast during Ramadan, you seek to do the pilgrimage in the Hajj in Saudi Arabia, you tell your coworkers, your neighbors that you only eat halal food, that all of that signifies or communicates to them that you have this biological like trait that causes you to be inherently suspect, right? That causes them to believe that your religion teaches you to abuse women, treat them as second-class citizens, so you're misogynistic. It teaches you to be violent. It teaches you to be despotic, to be hateful towards other people, including Jews, which is one of the Islamophobic stereotypes, that Muslims are presumptively anti-Semitic, notwithstanding that Arab Jews have lived in the Middle East and North Africa for centuries and thrived there, in stark contrast to the Jews of Eastern Europe, who effectively were victims of a massive genocide, right, in the Holocaust. So that then becomes the imputed characteristics upon you, similar to if somebody sees a Black person's skin color, right? And you now have the burden of proving individually that you are not all of those negative characteristics. And if you are successful in proving that to your neighbor, your coworker, your boss, the people who are in your direct life, then they'll say, okay, you're different. But that doesn't necessarily change the racialization process. And once you kind of understand that socio-political phenomena, then all of the laws start to make sense, such as the National Security Exit Entry Registration Program, which required all Muslim men who had non-immigrant visas between the ages of 15 to 45. Now, they didn't say Muslim men, they said all men from all these countries, who had nationalities of all these countries, but 90% of those countries were Muslim majority countries. So it was effectively Muslim men had to register with the US government so that they could know where they were at all times. They had to make sure their addresses were up to date. And failure to register, failure to keep your address up to date or any of your personal information was a basis for deportation. No one else had to do that. Right? And I wrote a law review article called A Muslim Registry, precursor to internment, ? That lays out the history of special registration programs for non-immigrants in the United States. And it has always been used against groups of people, usually non-European, who were suspected of having loyalty abroad to a foreign country that is an enemy or perceived to be an enemy of the US, and therefore they were seen as this internal threat. And so if the government couldn't outright deport them because of pesky immigration laws, then they would require them to register so that they could surveil them. Similarly, we had the Muslim ban, which was the first executive order that was issued by former President Donald Trump, and now convicted felon Donald Trump, that he kept his campaign promise. He ran on a platform of Islamophobia. He got votes. He raised money off of hating Muslims, and he won the election. So that is just another example of how popular it is and how profitable politically it is to be anti-Muslim. And then the final thing that also was very clear to us of the racialization and of Muslim identity and then the consequent inferior treatment was the way in which mosques were under surveillance for over a decade, and arguably until the present day. There were many cases that came to light, of course, after the fact, that the FBI was sending informants into mosques, that it was sending undercover agents into mosques. They claimed they were following specific individuals, that they had reasonable suspicion, were engaged in terrorism. But of course, when you actually ask them for more information, they refuse to give it to you. But by sending those people into mosques, it chilled religious liberty and religious exercise. So there was a period, and I remember this anecdotally, and I also remember this when I was an advocate in Washington, D.C., working with Muslim civil rights groups, We frequently heard Muslims say, I limit how much I go to the mosque because I believe there are spies everywhere. When I do go to the mosque, I don't talk to anybody. I just go pray and I leave. We saw imams being very, very circumspect in terms of what they lectured on. They started to lecture on very mundane and banal topics that were quote unquote safe rather than being free and independent in how they gave their religious Friday sermons. So there was a huge chilling effect and a sense that mosques were not safe places. They were places where the FBI sent spies to try to entrap and ensnare Muslims, especially Muslim men, into fake counterterrorism plots.
Yeah, no, that's all very striking. And it occurs to me, Professor Aziz, as you describe those things, there's a new generation of youths who might not, who definitely don't remember all of the things that were happening after 9/11 because of their age, if they're younger, even though, as you pointed to, those practices are often continuing to affect Muslim communities, but particularly the surveillance of the mosques, of the categorizing of Muslims as a threat to the United States, to America, is, as you pointed out, and as you note in your book, one of the hallmarks of this racialization process, where the nation itself, which is read to exclude the people who are, some people who are part of it, in this case, American Muslims, that the nation is said to be under threat because of Muslims, and we must do something about it. And that is how you've described anti-Black racism has functioned, where the Blacks are seen as a problem that America needs to deal with, or as a threat that America needs to protect itself from. Or you open with attention to indigeneity, and that indigenous Americans who are the original people of this land were immediately targeted as threats by the United States. And we know the material reasons for that: the land expansion, the desire of a white settler state to get land beneath the feet of indigenous peoples. But the point is that that racialization process, among other things, as you've described, it's invoking this notion of the nation that is under peril. And so the national security practices have been very extensive. You know, one of the things that you are pointing to and that you are elevating is the series of actions and national security practices that got put into force, but whose architecture was already present. So the extensive coordination between New York police departments, for example, and the FBI, and at one point even the CIA, which is not supposed to happen for surveilling and investigating domestic subjects, but was absolutely going on. And this has been documented that the CIA was actually embedded in the New York Police Department in order to surveil Muslims, was something that was riding on a history of national security practices that had been targeting Black Americans, and that ended up getting put into effect to target Americans or Muslims more broadly during this time. You talked with us about some of these processes, and I'm wondering if you could just say a bit more about some of those connections you've seen in your own work between some early historical practices that were going on, particularly with national security practices, and how that has affected American Muslim communities in the ways that you've documented and explained in your work.
Well, I relied heavily on your work, and I'm very grateful for the excellent research that you have done on religion in the United States, especially as it impacts African American communities as well as other communities. My book was intentionally a comparative book. I wanted to see how much of what Muslim and Arab and South Asian communities were experiencing post 9/11 was similar and different to racial minorities of other communities, and also religious minorities of other communities, and then racial and religious minorities that, you know, intersected at the two identities. And what I discovered, you know, as I said earlier, is that religiously based discrimination, and when I say, I should say the racialization of religious identity was not new, because we saw it with Jews and Catholics. I distinguish between theologically based religious discrimination and racialization of religious identity, meaning that when people are discriminated against because the perpetrator believes that the target is going to hell, they believe that their holy book, right, gives them license to mistreat another person because of their other faith. That is religiously based discrimination, theologically based discrimination. I mean, it's no more acceptable than other forms of discrimination, but I do think it's distinctly different than imputing upon people of a particular faith certain kind of inherent characteristics because of their identity, irregardless of whether those people actually practice their faith, have practiced their faith, don't practice at all. Because again, it's as if it's this imputable characteristic. And so with Catholics, for example, the Protestant, the discrimination that came from the primarily or predominantly Protestant American white society in the early 20th century was not just theologically based, but it was also this belief that Catholics could not ever be loyal to the United States. They could only be loyal, and they would only be loyal to the Pope. And that they didn't know how to engage in independent thinking and free thinking, which was required to be a good American, because Catholicism taught them to be sheep that just blindly obeyed the Pope, right? And similarly with Jews, there was, in addition to the theological bases for anti-Semitism as between, you know, Christianity and Judaism, but there was also the belief that they were communists, that they were anarchists, that they were these foreign Soviet spies because of where they had immigrated from in Eastern Europe, and that their Jewish identity, even those who were Jews simply by name, many of them may not even practice Judaism. They may consider themselves atheists, but of Jewish identity. It didn't matter, because that was how that works. So that's where we see a parallel with Muslim racialization, Muslim identity. But then when you also look at African Americans, and the question I had often when I was workshopping the book was, why is your book primarily about Muslims who immigrated from Muslim majority countries, most of whom, like the vast majority of them, came after 1965, when the immigration laws when national origin quotas were lifted from immigration laws. Because what a lot of people don't realize is the reason why the United States did not admit many, if any, I mean, a tiny minuscule of Jews during the Holocaust. I mean, the Jews were desperate to get out of Eastern Europe and out of Germany, and they wanted to come to the US, but they couldn't, because in 1924, a white Protestant nationalist Congress passed immigration laws that limited the number of people that could come from Eastern and Southern Europe, or countries from that region, to 2% of the census in 1890, which was before the very large wave of immigration of Jews and Catholics to the US. And so there were just a few slots for people who were effectively Jewish or Catholic until 1965. And then the Asian exclusion laws had been in effect, at least the Chinese one, until since the 1860s, and then it got expanded also in the 1920s. So that just gives you some context as to why Muslims whose origins are from the Middle East and North Africa most of them came after 1965, and they comprise about 70% of Muslims in America today. The other 25 to 30% are African American Muslims. And that's where the question is, well, why, can you compare them? Can you treat them in the same way in terms of the analysis? And this is where my position is that African American Muslims are Black first, that their phenotype is what is the most determinative, and their African ancestry, particularly sub-Saharan African ancestry, is the most determinative factor in their racialization. And the consequences, some of them are similar to Muslims of Middle East, North African origin, and some of them are very different, but they're tied directly to the legacies of slavery and indentured servitude and Jim Crow and so on and so forth. However, as you know very well from your research, African Americans who are Muslim were perceived as a particularly dangerous and a particularly violent and a particularly worthy of government repression as compared to other African American communities. And much of that, I think, is related to the Nation of Islam and to Malcolm X and to the Black Power movement, the Black nationalist movement, that was a clear challenge and rebuke of the white dominant, if not, we can call it white supremacist American society. But Islam was seen as a political ideology that made African Americans particularly dangerous to the white establishment. But having said that, I'm really interested in hearing your perspective on this, because this is really, you know a lot more about this subject than I do. I researched it relying heavily on your work and others to just show the differences and the similarities between, again, the Muslims who immigrated from Middle East, North Africa, and the African American Muslims who, whether you want to say they converted or whether they reverted, right, to Islam, but in the broader African American community, they're quite a small minority as compared to Christians and other religions. So I'd like to kind of invite you to pontificate about that and elaborate on that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Professor Aziz. And you're right; those parallels are really striking. And this is just underscoring the significance of really paying attention to these racialization processes instead of merely insisting that the only thing that's here is just religious persecution. That there needs to be another vector of understanding the full gamut of what's happening. So yes, you're right. The experience of African Americans who were Muslims, in particularly the earlier parts of the 20th century, was very formative for a lot of the ways the US government had begun to perceive Islam and began to develop these national security practices that were a coordination between the FBI and individual police departments, and this larger understanding of a national security emergency. It's not an accident that a lot of the striking layers or incidents of targeting politically or persecution are happening during wars. So one example that you know about and have examined is the efforts of Black Americans who are Muslims to exercise their dissent against the draft. So particularly members of the Nation of Islam, believed that it was actually some great sin for them to go out and participate in a U.S. war against other nations, particularly nations that were seen as members of what we might call the third world or non-white world. There's different language that they use to refer to that, but in the theology of the Nation of Islam, these were other peoples of color who were part of this larger theological understanding of the Nation of Islam and its connection to them as an actual nation of people, not a nation state, but a nation in this more theological and ethnic sense, theologically. And so they thought it was wrong, and this is what they taught. And they were denied the right to exercise conscientious objection because the US government really reduced their religious beliefs to being political activism and not religion. In fact, one of the more striking things that happened in the 1950s, the FBI actually created its own training manual to prepare FBI field agents to repress Black Americans who were Muslims. And they called it the manual referred to African Americans who were Muslims as being members of what the FBI called the Muslim cult of Islam. And it created this fictitious history of Black Muslims by claiming that, and this was an actual training manual that agents were required to use. It claimed that there was the type of atavistic or inherited sensibility that Black people had because they were Black that made them very violent, that caused them to resist authority. And this violence was actually, according to the FBI, the true dogma and the true essence of Black Islamic belief and faith. And for this reason, Black Muslims were basically acting out a quasi-genetic type of antagonism toward white Americans, or as the FBI would say it, toward the United States, which in the 1950s, the FBI defined quintessentially as being white and other races as not being part of that. And by using this to introduce field agents who knew nothing about Islam anyhow, who had never heard of usually these communities of Black Muslims, it actually employed a very racist way of understanding both Islam and these people in order to define how the practices and policies of national security should be exercised. And so that was officially part of the training. It was introducing these agents to a way of thinking about Islam and about Black people that was very devastating. There were mass arrests of Black Americans who were Muslims throughout the 20th century. And in many ways, it's evident how local police departments throughout the United States, as well as the FBI as the federal police power in the US, cut their teeth, so to speak, on an understanding of Islam by repressing Black Muslims. And so by the time you get to the 1960s, as you're writing about, when there's a much more diverse population of Muslims because of the lifting of those limits on non-white peoples immigrating to the United States. By the time that happens, and as there is a growth in non-Black Muslims, particularly in the US, by that point, the police departments, the FBI has already had decades of history of thinking about and practicing repression against Islam as something that was viewed as a threat to America, even though these people are Americans. So I think what's striking about what you pointed to is that there seems to be a kind of willful blindness to the fact that this history of racialization, which, as you point to, was targeting people of different races, including many peoples from Europe, who were viewed, as you've said, as inferior white races, inferior to Anglo-Saxon whites, for example. Even though that history is there, there's no sense in the records of the FBI or in the policies of the US or in the practices of policing. There's no sense of understanding the connection between those things. And no one with exercising police power is saying, well, we have this history of mistreating people earlier. Maybe we should revisit that and think about how its connection is being acted out here. It's as if there's no awareness and there's no admission of it. Interestingly, what actually started the FBI's attention to these very early communities of Black Muslims in the 20th century, we know there were communities of Muslims earlier who were brought here during human trafficking, enslaved, who were Muslims. But in the 20th century, the reason why the FBI actually started repressing these communities, according to the FBI's own account, is because the Moorish Science Temple of America was the community that really first came under repression by police and then the FBI. By the FBI's account, it was because they were preaching racial equality. That's what the FBI records show, and this was, of course, against U.S. laws at the time that assumed racial inequality. The US was an officially segregated, racially stratified society. So segregation and racism were actually legally protected. And there were official and unofficial doctrines of white racial supremacy that were embraced in the US. And so technically the FBI is right. What the Moore Science Temple of America was preaching did go against the grain of what was the official political and racial order in the United States. And yet at the same time, we also know there are lots of anti-racist traditions in the US and these articulations of democracy that claim people are actually equal, that didn't just happen in the 20th century. There are founding documents that articulate that. So it's not as if the FBI had never heard of this idea before. But that actually is what initially got the attention of police and the FBI. It was preaching racial equality. And it also helps to explain why many Black Americans began to convert to Islam, because there was often, not always, but there was often this teaching, and the Ahmadiyya movement was one denomination of Islam that converted people in the US, and it taught this racial equality. Black Americans who were Muslims really elevated that as something that was very important. And it's not that no other religions taught this, but if you look at the actual practice of mainstream Christianity in the United States, most people who are represented with that meant were doing so in a way that was actually in support of racism. And so it is understandable why a lot of Black Americans would hear this teaching in Islam and say, oh, well, we want to convert to this religion that actually teaches that people are actually equal, regardless of their racial background. It's also interesting, the Moore Science of Temple of America actually claimed that Black Americans were not Black, that they were Moorish. and so this was confounding to police authorities as well, not only because they were claiming racial equality, but they were claiming that they weren't, the term that they were using at that time was Negro. They were claiming, well, we're not actually Negroes. We are Moorish American. And just as other people claim heritage, and those are typically white Americans claim the heritage of being Italian or being Polish or being Irish, whatever, they said, we have a heritage. And we want to celebrate that, and we want to be recognized for it. So that also created a lot of resistance, and the fact that they were exercising an authentic, sincere set of convictions and commitments did not result in the recognition of their religious rights. It resulted in their persecution. So that's some of the background here, that by the time, again, we get to the late 20th century and the early 21st century with 9/11, there had been so many ways that there was a sharpening, creation, and strengthening of national security practices that in these instances collectively were clearly creating a lot of harm to these communities that did not secure the nation. It actually made people far less safe. And it was done with usually with legal cover and legal protection for actors of the state who were creating severe trauma, who were destabilizing these communities, who were incarcerating people and detaining them in huge numbers, and who insisted that even though these people claimed to have a religion, that they were really just a political organization. That was the assumption, and that it had something to do with who they were as a race that made them violent naturally and opposed to authority. And it had something to do with their trying to dress up politics as religion, and that authority should not be fooled. So those were very harmful precedents. And as your work has shown, it has come back in a way with all of these added technologies of surveillance and a lot more high level support for these claims of national security that has ended up being very detrimental to American Muslims.
Well, one of the kind of glaring comparisons or similarities is this redefining of a religion as a political ideology, and that we certainly saw after 9/11. And I do agree with you that the conceptual frame or the conceptual foundation had already been established with African American Muslims, because uh, what many Christian evangelicals, politicians, and religious leaders were the narrative they were peddling to their constituencies to justify, again, persecuting a religious minority, because especially Christian evangelicals, that is one of their biggest grievance, is that the so-called secular America and the secularists on the coasts are infringing on the religious liberty rights of Middle America and Christian evangelicals in the middle of in the Midwest and the South. They of all people are sensitized to religious freedom rights. And so for them to reconcile that, they had convinced quite a number of Americans that, well, Islam really isn't a religion, not by our definition. It's a violent political ideology.
Yeah, so we've discussed some of these violations of religious liberty, but there have also been many different legal protections for religious liberties. So people might say, well, given the legacy of the U.S. Constitution's containing this provision for the free exercise of religion and all of the court cases that have happened over time, that surely the U.S. on the whole does a good job of protecting religious liberty. So what might you say to that?
Where religious discrimination, or I should say discrimination against people who follow a particular religion or have a certain identity, tend to be very weak, is in the immigration context and in the national security context. Because the government will argue, we are not practicing or we are not passing these policies or enforcing these policies or engaging in these practices because the people are Muslim. We're doing so because of their national origin. Or we're doing so because of national security, not because of religious identity. And it's very difficult to prove that it is actually based on your religious identity that you are being selectively screened at airports, or that you have been put on a no-fly list, or that you're in a secondary screening list, or that you are subjected to frequent visits by immigration enforcement authorities, or that your mosques are being targeted for surveillance. Because again, the government will say, no, it's not because it's a mosque, it's not because of your religion, it's because we believe that there are suspicious people who attend, and we can't tell you anything else, if they even admit to that. So when you take, and oftentimes the cases are based on equal protection claims. So if it's not straight religious discrimination, then you'll say, well, you're treating me different. You're discriminating against me based on my religious identity. And you have to prove that the state is intentionally targeting you or discriminating against you. It has to be what we call disparate treatment, not disparate impact, meaning that it is intentional that they're going after you, rather than it's just a consequence of a general facially neutral policy and practice. So in travel, for example, the government will pass policies that say, if you're traveling to certain countries, you will be secondarily screened, such as Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Iran, other Middle Eastern countries. They'll say it has nothing to do with your identity. But if we ask ourselves, well, who tends to visit those countries? Oftentimes it is people, members of the diaspora of that country, or people who are doing business in the region, and they probably have the language skills and the cultural competency and familiarity that would cause them to have an Arab identity or a Muslim identity. Those cases are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to win unless you can find some kind of smoking gun, which is hard to find because of classified information and the lack of transparency. And also you have judges who, whether it's because they are earnestly ignorant and just their lived experiences are so restricted due to our heavily segregated society that is segregated along class, which then overlaps onto race and minority status, that they simply just cannot fathom and understand the realities of minority communities and how they interact with the state, whether it's the police or the local government or their elected officials or schools, or by private actors, how they interact and how their neighbors treat them and their colleagues treat them and so on and so forth, that they just don't believe the plaintiffs. They give the government the benefit of the doubt. They give the defendants the benefit of the doubt, or that they do know, but they don't care. And they think that, well, that's just the price we have to pay. Actually, the price you have to pay as a minority for us, the majority, to feel safe. Whether it in fact keeps us safe or not is irrelevant, but it's important that we feel safe. And as long as we don't believe that those civil liberties infringements on your community will impact our community, well, how convenient that it is a price we're willing to pay. And I think that kind of goes back to why it's so important to have diversity within the judiciary. Diversity in terms of defense counsel and plaintiffs counsel, right? Prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys, civil rights lawyers, as well as corporate law lawyers, and diversity along gender and race and religious identity and LGBTQ identity and so on and so forth. Because if the judges live in a bubble, it's much harder for them to believe parties when they bring forward facts that cause them this cognitive dissonance and challenge what they believe, challenge their notions of reality of the country they live in. So I think that's also important. And then finally, most cases are resolved by district courts. Very few will go to the appellate level, and a tiny fraction ever get to the Supreme Court. And in order to even get to the district court, a party has to have an attorney. Many of these are civil cases. It means you have to pay for that attorney. And by definition, when you are a minority group, you tend to be less resourced in society, and you tend to have a lower ability to be able to afford to hire the lawyers to pursue your rights. So you often end up waiving those rights and just having to accept this state of inferiority and this mistreatment in society because you don't have the means and the resources to go to court to actually challenge it. And again, remember, litigation is the tool of the weak, right? It is the avenue for people who cannot preserve their rights and their dignity and their equality through the social political system. And so to make matters even worse for those communities is they also cannot even afford to utilize the tool of the weak by going to litigation.
Yeah, no, that's so well said, Professor Aziz, and such a great point to make that even if there is recourse through the courts, it's very costly. So it's not a practical reality for many victims of discrimination. And the different ways, particularly along the lines of national security issues, that the state actors can be veiled in secrecy to make it impossible to challenge certain things, has had such a detrimental effect on minority communities. I know also we'll just add to that with African-derived religions particularly, and this is your point about having a minority status and being on the underside of these dominant systems of political power and social power. African-derived religions particularly have suffered both from being derided and devalued as diabolical, instead of recognizing that these are actually human communities whose religions emerge in the way that other human communities have emergence of religion and said, oh, that's satanic, or that's evil, that voodoo stuff, or that Santeria is something we don't want in our communities.
Professor Johnson, I wanted to ask you about a different dimension of religious liberty. We've been talking quite a bit about state actors and the way that the state infringes on religious liberty, or at least chills it. But there is the other component of threats to religious liberty, which is by private actors. And so could you tell us a little bit more about how private actors have influenced religious liberty in Black religious groups and Black, whether it's for Black Muslims or Black Christians or other religions within African American communities?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many examples. This is a great question because it's easy to assume it's just the state. It's not just the state. It's a societal thing. Were often cases where individuals who owned real estate would refuse to sell to members of either Black religious groups, or particularly of were called new religious movements. And some of what we've been talking about were the Nation of Islam was at one point a new religious movement. The Moorish Science Temple of America was one. The Peace Mission is another, led by Father Divine, it was called. And they struggled to gain the ability, that is the Peace Mission movement, which started in New York, to purchase real estate so that they could actually have a place not just to worship, but also have places for members to live. The Peace Mission was led by Father Divine, who was an African-American religious leader who founded the organization. It was multiracial. And so they had white members who joined the Peace Mission. And it was their white members who would often purchase real estate on behalf of the Peace Mission Society, because there were other private actors who owned real estate would not sell to Black people, and particularly those who belonged to this religious movement. So that was one way that they tried to navigate around that. Another example is very extensive, is actually the role of media companies in shaping public perception of these movements. And that's everything from Christian groups who were part of the civil rights movement, to Muslim groups who were part of pro-democracy movements for decades, to these other new religious movements. The African-derived religious movements, for example, were often, and to some degree this sometimes still happens, but particularly in the 20th century, were often portrayed as a cult. That word was often used in a derisive sense. We know that sociologists have worked out a way to use that term in a technical way to refer to how large an organization is, but it's not a judgment about it. But in the public discourse, the term cult is often used to refer to a harmful, dangerous group that we should not have in our society. And so you see something you don't like, you call it a cult. And particularly if it's something that's new. And that response by the media immediately shaped the perception of people who were reading an article or who were watching a TV program. And that had a huge impact on public perceptions. One striking example of this was the documentary "The Hate That Hate Produced," that was produced about the Nation of Islam, and at a time that most white Americans had never heard of the Nation of Islam, and actually most Black Americans who were not Muslim had never heard of it. People's first introduction to it was that this was a hate group. And of course, that mirrored the FBI's way of describing the Nation of Islam, that they were a hate group. And so the American public audience, not having known anything else, there's a documentary, it's widely viewed, and your friends ask you, have you watched The Hate That Hate Produced? And so that was actually the way most people first heard about it. That documentary actually introduced many law enforcement people to the Nation of Islam. Many police departments had never heard about it, and they saw this documentary. It's like, oh, there's this cult called the Nation of Islam, and they're teaching hate of the white race, and so we must go after them. So that actually had a lot of power. It had a lot of influence, and because media can be transmitted so effectively. And if it's done well, people watch it in ways they're probably not gonna read a police report or an FBI website, but they'll watch a documentary or they'll watch a film. And so that has had a huge impact on these perceptions. And we know there are positive uses of media, but in terms of looking at challenges to religious freedom or shaping public perceptions of religious communities that then lead people to act toward those communities in a certain way, the media has actually played a very important role. And then the last thing I'd say is because state actors have understood the power of media, unfortunately, repeatedly throughout America's history, there's been a relationship between law enforcement and media. So one program that is familiar to experts who study these histories of state repression is something called COINTELPRO, which is a shorthand for counterintelligence program that ran by the FBI starting in the 1950s. Supposedly it ended in the 1970s, but there's clear evidence that it did not stop. The FBI claimed it stopped in the 70s, but these practices have continued, as you have documented and others have documented, well into the 21st century. But the counterintelligence program was based on what was called intelligence activity, which at one level means gathering information, but it's not limited to gathering information. It also involves certain practices of doing things to affect the community. And then counterintelligence is the term that law enforcement has used to refer to tactics or practices that are not just collecting information about someone, it's trying to disrupt those organizations. And the counterintelligence program, when it was launched in the 50s, it started largely with targeting people who were suspected of being communists. And communism is actually not, is part of American history. It's part of the American labor movement. Helen Keller, who's a great celebrated person in American history, was a communist, but many other people were in shaping labor rights. But people who were suspected of communism were treated as enemies of the United States. And so one of the things that was done to target them was the FBI partnered with media companies in order to produce articles about those organizations. And then it would be printed by a local newspaper or by some news station. And it had been created by the FBI, but those news organizations agreed to disseminate it as something that came from them. And so this gave the government a public voice through media, and people didn't realize it was the government. They just assumed, oh, this is our local news agency and we trust them to tell us about our world, our society. Well, that happened to target Black religious groups particularly, and not just religious groups, but also secular groups that were pro-democracy movements in the 1960s and 70s. But it just points to the power of shaping practices that have a huge impact on religious communities that are not just state practices, but in this case, these were private companies that were media companies. And then we can even look at the collection of data that required what at the time was the Bell Company, and then you get other telephone companies that participated in sharing information about different groups. And we know more recently, particularly in the 9/11 era, that technology companies were so significant to the ability of the National Security Agency and the FBI and the CIA to surveil and target American Muslims. And that was everything from collecting their information through their electronic devices to using very sophisticated equipment to capture people's conversations, just all kinds of things. So those are private actors. So we have examples of individual citizens, civic organizations, often other religious communities that might see these religious communities as a threat, as well as large companies that have been quite integral to the experiences that have been quite harmful to these religious minorities.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to your discussion about COINTELPRO. That was an analogy that many civil liberties lawyers were making after 9/11, especially after the Patriot Act was passed and after surveillance was discovered, often by mistake. Sometimes it was because, well, often it was because someone heard or there was some litigation and a document was provided that wasn't supposed to be provided, only for the individual to discover that they had been under surveillance for years. And also when the government did start prosecuting through the process of discovery, the defendants would realize that they had been under surveillance for much longer than they had realized. And so there's something called the third party doctrine in the law, which effectively allows private companies, or let me say this, it does not require private companies to not provide your information to others, right? So you can't, once you are effectively consenting, once you use a private company for internet, for any kind of app, telephone, and therefore there is no requirement for a warrant, or there is no Fourth Amendment right against unlawful or unreasonable search and seizure. And that has been a way in which government has been able to indirectly surveil people, is that instead of putting a wiretap or directly onto one's account, is they will go and ask a third party to provide them with information, either through a national security letter, through which is a form of an administrative subpoena, meaning that they don't have to go to a court in order to get the information. They can just use reasonable suspicion rather than probable cause. And also they can buy it. And this is really becoming the biggest threat now is data brokers. Yes. So anything that a private actor can purchase, any data on us that a private company can purchase, the government can also purchase.
Right.
So it's just a matter of resources.
Yes, that's correct.
And that is significant because while we may not all agree or prefer that private companies have our personal data, private companies cannot put us in jail. Right. Private companies cannot prosecute us. They cannot arrest us. They cannot threaten our liberty directly. Whereas when the government has that personal information and uses it for prosecutorial reasons, then the stakes are much, much higher. But thus far, the law has failed to protect our privacy rights in that regard. And the fact that everything now is being digitized and we are completely dependent on technology to exist in modern society has caused many legal scholars to believe that the law is way, way behind, and especially with regard to individual rights and privacy protection. So that's another kind of vulnerability that the government can exploit, so long as it has the resources to purchase the data.
So my last question to you, Professor Aziz, is about the future. So what's your hope for the future of religious liberty as you think forward, given all the things that we've discussed? What do you find as a reason for being optimistic?
My optimism lies in the youth. It's 2024, and what we're witnessing on college campuses is historic. It is probably the largest university-led social movement that we've seen since the anti-Vietnam War social movement. I am optimistic that as they lead us into a very different future, I am optimistic that as our country becomes more diverse, more multi-religious and multiracial, and we get the percentages of interracial marriages and interfaith marriages are increasing, that hopefully that will create a society where less people are able to act on, well, first to hold biases against religious minorities or racial minorities, but even if they do hold those biases, that they can't act on them so that they don't hurt, other innocent people who happen to have the misfortune of interacting with them in their lives.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's very compelling, Professor Aziz. I agree with you. I think the expressions we've seen from younger generations who are willing to speak out and express their voice and call for justice for all peoples, not just some, is definitely something to be very hopeful about, and it's very inspiring. And I would just add to that, I think that as we continue to see the work by civil society, more people engaging in elevating human rights, in being able to articulate their commitment to a system of justice that goes beyond the state. And the state has to play a role, but we have seen how many times that has failed. For me, I think the work, the activism of people who are civically engaged is definitely something to be hopeful about when that activism is trying to advance opportunities and rights for more people. We have other uses of civic engagement that try to limit those rights, and when we've seen the consequences of that. But people are being more vocal in being committed to truly expanding democratic processes, in recognizing the varieties of religious communities and the people of those communities having the need and the right to be able to participate with dignity and the fullness of who they are. So I'm inspired by that as well, and I think ultimately that has that's gotten us to where we are, and the positive gains that we've seen for these civil liberties and human rights. And as it goes forward, I think that's what has to drive it. Well, I want to thank our viewers, our listeners, so much for joining us. I want to thank you, Professor Aziz. It's really been great to have this conversation with you.
Thank you.
And
It has been a pleasure.
yeah, and I'm sure everyone's learned a lot from all that we've been able to share. Thank all of you as well for watching.